Vampire remains were found about 30 years ago. Now DNA is giving him new life. Hello, I'm your host Al Cooley, and welcome to Ghost in the Valley. I've done episodes on UFOs, cryptids, Bigfoot, spirits, ghost, fae, but I've never done one on a vampire. And today is my first real-life vampire story. Today's article is by Michael E. Ruane from the Washington Post. And when I came across this article, I was blown away. Well, I never heard of John Barber before. I thought I would share this during my Halloween episodes. So let's get right to it. The skeleton of possibly John Barber was studied at the National Museum of Health and Medicine, and Barber was believed to be a vampire. In fact, most likely he died of tuberculosis, or back in the 1800s, that was also known as consumption. I just wonder how many people were actually buried alive, or buried from diseases that could have been cured, yet they were labeled wrongly. You're either a vampire or a witch, a lunatic, crazy, put into asylums, buried, burned. And I feel John Barber was one of these people. And I think Michael Ruane reported this case exceptionally well. John Barber was in his grave so long that when his family dug him up to burn his heart, the organ had decomposed and was not there. Desperate to stop him from stalking them after death, because that's what the legend says, vampires do most their stalking after death, they took his head and limbs and rearranged them on top of his ribs in the design of a skull and crossbones. That was the common practice in the 1800s, 1700s of people that were supposedly to be vampires. He was a vampire after all, and in rural New England in the early 1800s, this was how you dealt with them. When they were finished, they reburied him in his stone-lined grave and replaced a wooden coffin lid on which someone had used brass tacks to form the inscription JB 55 for his initials and his age. Now, 200 years or so after the death of what has become the country's best studied vampire, DNA have tracked down his probable name as John Barber, and hence the JB 55 that was partially found on the coffin lid. He probably was a hard-working farmer, missing his top front teeth, so he was no neck biter. He had a broken collarbone that had not healed right, and an arthritic knee that may have made him limp, and he had died an awful death, probably from tuberculosis, which was so bad it had scarred his ribs. The latest findings in a case that started in 1990, when his coffin was discovered in a gravel quarry in Griswold, Connecticut. And all this was contained in a new report by the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System DNA Laboratory in Dover, Delaware. The report was summarized in a presentation on July 23rd at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Springs, which aided the study and is where the remains are held. The case is so unusual because Barber may be the country's only supposed vampire whose bones have been studied by scientists. Let me repeat that because that's key here. The case is unusual because Barber may be the country's only supposed vampire whose bones have been studied by scientists. This case has been a mystery since the 1990s. Charlotte Marshall said in an email that this case has been a mystery since the 1990s. Marshall was a forensic scientist with SNA International in Alexandria, Virginia, who worked on the project. Now that we have expanded technological capabilities, we wanted to revisit JB55 to see whether we could solve the mystery or who he was. It is the latest chapter in a project that has cast light on the eerie vampire scare in New England, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, especially in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and its connection to the spread of tuberculosis, or consumption as it was called. The highly contagious disease was so wasting and terrifying that those who died of it were believed to leave their graves, infecting relatives and draining away blood and life, scholars have said. That is why they exhumed the bodies of these supposedly vampires, removed their heart, drained their blood of the heart, or burned the heart. This was not bats flying around through the night, says Nicholas F. Bellamontoni, the retired Connecticut state archaeologist who worked on the case from the start and is one of the report's authors. This is not Bela Lugosi. The terror they brought was real. Consumption often caused a bloody cough and left victims pale and gaunt with blood in the corners of their mouths. Author and folklorist Michael E. Bell wrote, "The forehead covered with drops of sweat, the cheeks a livid crimson, the eyes sunk, the breath offensive, quick, and laborious. The vampire's true menace seemed to come after death, and he had to be killed again during what Bell called therapeutic exhumation. Often, the suspected vampire was a family member who had died of the disease and was thought to be infecting sons, daughters, or a wife. Family friends were frequently the ones conducting the exhumation. Bell had documented 80 such cases, mostly in remote areas of New England. This was being done out of fear and out of love, Bellatoni said. People were dying in their families, and they had no way of stopping it. And just maybe this was what could stop the deaths. They didn't want to do this, but they wanted to protect those that were still living. People were desperate, he said. The best method of killing the suspected vampire was to check the exhumed corpse to see whether any liquid blood remained in the heart. If so, the deceased was probably a vampire, according to the belief. The heart was then removed and burned, with family members sometimes inhaling the smoke to prevent further disease. Similar incidents have long turned up in Europe, where there are many accounts of corpses being dug up, burned, rearranged, decapitated, or having stakes driven through them. In Barber's case, there was probably no heart to burn. Bellantoni and Paul S. Sledzik wrote in 1994, "So the bones of the chest were disrupted, and the skull and thigh bones were placed in a skull and crossbone position," they wrote. After Barber's grave was discovered, a thigh bone was sent to the DNA lab for analysis. The technology of 30 years ago yielded scant results, the paper authors wrote, and identification was impossible. They checked old cemetery and newspaper records to see whether any Barbers ever lived in Griswold. They discovered a newspaper notice mentioning the death there in 1826 of a 12-year-old boy named Nathan Barber, whose father was John Barber. Researchers have found a grave near JB's containing a coffin with the notation NB13 tacked on the lid. The project began in November of 1990, when an abandoned cemetery was encountered during a mining at a sand and gravel facility in Griswold, according to study by Sledzik, Valentoni, and colleague David A. Portier. Human skeletons and crumbling coffin parts emerged from the earth, and 2 human skulls tumbled down an embankment when 3 boys playing there dislodged them. Investigators eventually removed the remains of 27 people, 5 men, 8 women, and 14 children, from 28 graves in what scholars discovered was an old burying ground called the Walton Family Cemetery. One grave contained evidence of a coffin, but no human remains. It was grave number 4 that drew the most attention. Everyone was in good anatomical position, except this one individual, JB 55, Valentoni said. Under his coffin lid, Valentoni and his colleagues found the strange skull and crossbone arrangement. His thigh bones was uprooted in anatomical position and crossed over the chest, he said. The chest had been broken into, and the skull was decapitated and moved away. I had no clue what I was looking at. Research soon suggested a link to the New England vampire folk belief, he said. So JB turned out to have tuberculosis, evident because of lesions on his ribs, he said. We do believe that he was arranged in the grave because he was believed to be undead. Valentoni said JB had probably been deceased 4 or 5 years when he was exhumed, which, based on his recovered coffin hardware, probably happened in the early 1800s. In New England, we had large farming families, he said, because they didn't understand the transmission of the disease. You had family members who were suffering from tuberculosis sitting at the dinner table with the whole family coughing, and you had tuberculosis victims sleeping in one room with 5 or 6 brothers and sisters coughing. It was epidemic, he said. So what now of poor John Barber, the alleged vampire? Listen, Valentoni said. He was a hard-working farmer, probably lower middle class. You could see it in his bones. You could see it in the arthritic condition of his vertebrae. Hard working. Good Christian man, I am sure. So why was a Connecticut farmer suspected of being a vampire half a decade after his death? In the early 1800s, a vampire panic swept New England and other parts of the United States 2 full centuries after the witch pandemic. Was this because of the outspread disease of tuberculosis, consumption? Because it was a highly contagious disease and family members got it and it spread through the communities. So naturally they want to put an end to this by exhuming the dead that they consider was a vampire. The general idea was to dig up the corpse to stop the activity of the widespread panic. And if the heart was still present and contained blood, it was a sign that the corpse was a vampire. The heart should not contain blood. And while many exhumations were private affairs done at night, in Vermont, vampire heart burnings were public festivities, with entire towns attending. But Michael Bell, author of Food for the Dead on the Trail of New England's Vampires, has chronicled 80 exhumations stretching from New England to Minnesota. JB 55's corpse remains the only physical evidence of the practice discovered by archaeologists. An examination of his remains confirms that he too suffered from tuberculosis. I found it fascinating that my episode coming out Later this week, the Vampire Crypt in Erie, Pennsylvania. Inside that crypt was also the remains of a person who died of consumption or tuberculosis. And the folklore is quite chilling on a lot of these stories. JB55 was not the only vampire to pop up in Griswold, Connecticut. In the 1840s, Henry and Lucy Ray and their 5 children lived in Jewett City, now a part of Griswold. Over the course of 2 decades, Henry and his 2 adult sons, Lemuel and Elijah, died of a wasting disease. When a 3rd son began showing signs of tuberculosis in 1854, the family dug up the corpse of Lemuel and Elijah and burned them in the graveyard, an event that was widely covered by the local newspapers was likely inspired by the same beliefs that led to JB55's exhumation. So JB55 is known to be the only known vampire to be examined by scientists. I want to thank the Washington Post, Michael E. Ruane, and also correspondent Jason Daly for this report. I'm your host, Al Cooley. Thank you for listening on Ghosts in the Valley podcast.